Hello and welcome to this lecture series on my Introduction to Psychology class. I've been looking for an opportunity for quite a long time to create videos for this entire class, and this semester has given me that opportunity. What these videos are going to do is cover the material that is available in my course book, which is a accompanying text that goes along with all of my classes that outlines the content that I'm focusing on specific to this particular course and goes into the assessments that I'm expecting my students to engage in. So in this first video, we're actually going to look at chapter 1, and which is an introduction to the field. Now, before we get into that, we have to recognize that psychology is a very popular field. Lots of people like psychology. If you go to any bookstore, there's, the how people think and how people work, how people are attracted to one another, how do we solve problems, interactions and communications and all of this. Probably one of the largest sections in the bookstore. The problem with psychology being really popular is that it feeds into the idea of creating myths. There's lots of ideas that have come both from scientists who were misguided, possibly historically because they didn't have the instruments or the knowledge that we had today, but also individuals creating ideas about how the mind works that are really not holding out when it comes to the actual research. So let's start off. In my course book, there are some links to a couple documents that I have called the Myths and Facts of Psychology. So this is what those documents look like. Just a collection of the different things that I've discovered along the years that are currently still out there, particularly on the myth side. Let's take a look at this one right here. This is birth order. You might have heard that oldest children are more leaders, the youngest are spoiled, and the middle one is sort of a lost child. And this particular theory held sway in the field of psychology for quite some time. And I will tell you, I'm one of 3 brothers, and I'm the youngest, spoiled rotten, the oldest, millionaire leader. Middle one went through a whole period of time of being lost, finding his identity. We were textbook birth order kids, 3 boys, my poor mother. But yet it doesn't hold out. Personality is not significantly impacted by your birth order. There are other factors that come into play. We might see those tendencies, but it's the same way we might see things that we want to see. When we have preconceived ideas and we want to be able to find out that those are true, that's the kind of thinking that leads us to see those instances as being true. It does not hold up when we actually do the research. Now, another one that is extremely popular is the notion of learning styles. Now, learning styles are a very popular concept in education, and you have probably taken some sort of test having to do with learning styles that determine that you're a visual learner, an auditory learner, kinesthetic learner, whatever. Here's the deal. Those are actually not substantiated in the research. They have not been clearly defined, and there's no acceptable instrument. It doesn't mean that they're not there. It doesn't mean that we might not be better at visual learning. For instance, I am a very good visual learner. If I can watch somebody do something, I can probably imitate it. I just have that ability to do that. Maybe you have that too. Maybe if you sit in a lecture, you can really get that information, maybe when you're using your hands and whatnot. Here's the point. The wrongness of learning outcomes is that we sort of have used them as a way to define my best way of learning. So my best way of learning would be visual. And that actually is not true, because the best way to learn something really depends on what we're trying to learn. If I'm trying to learn theoretical physics, my vision is not going to help me. I'm going to have to do other things. Neither will my kinesthetic. So the idea of translating material to one modality or the other is really not supported in the literature. if you're a teacher and you can present material auditorily, visually, kinesthetically, and any other way that you might, artistically, musically, fun, all of that combines to increase the channels coming in that we're able to learn from. This is not a method that would say, I am doing this because of my visual learners and I'm doing this because of my auditory learners. That is actually not true. And so a little bit of shaking up people's world. This is still something that people have a lot of connection to. But in truth, if you're a visual learner and you need to learn something, take the opportunities to learn them auditorily, because you want to increase your weakest areas. If you're already good at visual learning, then try to learn things in your auditory area. And you'll be able to become a better auditory learner. You are not trapped by that test. It's not even a valid test anyway. So that's one of the myths associated with psychology. Now let's take a look. Hope that didn't get you dizzy. We're looking at the other page here, some of the facts about psychology here. Nerve impulses travel at between 300 and 400 feet per second. These little guys really truck right along. And I'm going to tell you, when we get into that, it's going to be right around chapter 3, we're going to get into biopsychology. And we look at the bio-neurochemical electrical process that occurs inside the neuron. The fact that it can move this fast, it's kind of mind-blowing. It's really, really amazing. Now finally, let's take a look at one more here. Playing with dogs increases the level of joy-inducing hormones. This is actually true. Patting a dog makes you feel better. Now it's got to be a dog that's not biting you at the time. That's probably a good idea. But it's, you know, the actual texture of the fur with your hand, stimulating nerves in your hand, release hormones in your body to make you feel good. So if you like playing with dogs and puppies and patting dogs, and probably cats too. I'm a cat person, so I get a lot of joy from my cats. And it's real. That really is a thing. And it's the whole history, actually, of humans and their domesticated animals is a whole great study in anthropological psychology. That's another field within psychology or within anthropology, depending on where you're coming from. But the examination of how animals, particularly dogs, became, quote unquote, man's best friend, moving from wolves closer and closer to the fire. There's a whole lot of research that's actually done on that, and how we evolved an attraction to each other that includes this particular aspect of our nervous system. So, a little bit of introduction into where we're going, talking about the myths and facts here. Let's talk right now about what I'm expecting you to get out of this chapter. So the learning outcomes, first you're going to define psychology. We're going to spend some time talking about that. Provide examples of the goals of psychology. So first you have to review the goals themselves and then provide some examples. Describe the influences of specific schools of thought throughout the history of psychology. I'm going to be taking you to a web page, and there's additional information inside of the course book about the history and where that has led us in terms of psychology today, and some of those myths that we. I was just reading last night on the history of what a field in psychology very early, 1700s to early 1800s, called phrenology. And phrenology was an analysis of the bumps on the skull that were correlated to separate organs. It's perceived that the brain was comprised of separate organs, each of which was responsible for a particular ability. So if you had a particular pronounced bump over here, and that's the area that's being correlated, people who have a bump there have been friendly. That friendliness, getting along with other people, part of your brain, that was a way, look at analyzing the textures and bumps on your head was a way to determine what aspects of your brain are actually more pronounced and more developed. Of course, we know that that's not true. However, when we look at how knowledge gets built, up until that point, the brain was considered just one thing, housed the soul. That's all it did. There was no location of function. Then along comes this science that says different parts of the brain are responsible for different things. They got it totally wrong, but it did introduce the idea that maybe different parts of the brain do different things. So you see, even when the field has been off, what other scientists have been able to do is they take that idea, get rid of the stuff that's not true, but say maybe, it's not the bumps on the head, but maybe different parts of the brain do different things. And we find that that was true. So that was a really neat way in which a historical wrong road actually led to some really interesting research. Now, finally, we're going to discuss the diversity of interests and foci. That's plural for focuses, foci in the field of psychology. We're going to take a look at the American Psychological Association. So let's get started here. First, let's talk about the word psychology. And you see I've colored this in a way that the two parts of the word are separated. So we have the first part, psycho, and logi, making up this word. Now, the origin of this word actually comes from psycho, although we use that pejoratively, and there's a great Alfred Hitchcock movie by that name. It actually comes from the Greek and Latin, all of these things do, meaning the soul or the mind. Remember the idea that the brain held the soul and the mind were considered to be the same thing. On the other side, we see this very popular end of words called logi. And this refers to actually knowledge. And truthfully, it's a generic term that is attached to a lot of different terms. The original Latin was to speak about. Logos, and you see its relation to the word logic. It's the speaking out of a field of knowledge. So that evolved into a variety of uses of that to actually describe the field of knowledge when we refer to the first part of the word. We have all kinds of examples of that. We have biology, sociology, geology. You're probably pretty familiar with those. Biology, the study of bio, meaning the natural world, sociology, society, geology, it's actually geography, but also the rock formations within the earth. And then there's nephrology. I'm familiar with this one because my brother was a nephrology nurse. Nephro refers to the Greek word for the kidney. So these are individuals that have to do with dialysis and kidney function. Another one, ichthyology. Again, we see the Latin roots here. Ich, referring to fish. This is the study of fish. Somnology. Probably heard of the drug Sominex to fall asleep, and that'll give you a little clue on that. Somnology is the study of sleeping. And what I've just been doing is a process called etymology, which is the study of the origin of words. So you see logi all over the place, that knowledge, and then the first word being psycho in this particular example. So here's a definition of psychology, the scientific study of human and animal behavior. Again, I want to divide this up to these three parts. We see scientific study, human and animal, and behavior in this short but very comprehensive definition. The scientific study refers to the scientific method. This is the decidedly very intentional way in which we gather information. We'll be talking about that in chapter 2. The focus of this is on human and animals. We have a long history in the field of psychology of comparing the behavior of animals to human behavior. You probably even heard of like having rats run through mazes and understanding chimpanzees and stuff like that, because and the idea of that is evolutionary in nature, meaning lower animals share a genetic inheritance, and if we understand them, then we can understand more evolutionarily evolved human beings by making that translation. Now, this is controversial that we can make that many jumps of logic, that because the rat did this, then that means something for human beings. But it was certainly easier in the field of psychology to study animals because, you could keep them in cages and make them do bizarre things like run through mazes. And even if you wanted to do surgery on them, you didn't need anybody's permission for that. So psychology, in the history of psychology, had to use animals because they couldn't use human beings like that. You couldn't keep human beings in the rat lab or human lab, make them run through mazes and stuff. That'd be unethical. Doesn't mean that we haven't done any unethical things, and we'll be discussing some of those in chapter 2. So we look at animal and human behavior, and here's that term behavior. And I have this graphic here of the microscope looking at the brain. What I'm trying to say here is that psychology, because of the scientific method, limits its scope to the best possible of things it can directly observe. Now, oftentimes in the field of psychology, we can't directly observe. If somebody has an idea, we may know that they have an idea, but we can't directly observe the process by which they came up with that idea. That's a real challenge. And, when you're looking at someone lift weights, they either did it or didn't, got halfway or needed somebody to help them get the other way. That's pretty easy behavior to watch. And we do watch behavior like that. But how do we get inside the mind? And we create direct observations of indirect measures. I'll give you an example because you have been doing this for quite some time. You're in school and you're learning about the history of the United States. Now you're going through and you're reading about facts and whatnot, and there's processes in your mind. But how does your teacher know that those things are going on in your head? They don't take a stethoscope. They don't cut a hole, look to see if enough American history is in there. They give you an indirect measure. It's called testing. Testing is an outward behavior that shows evidence of what might be going on inside. Bing! There's a light bulb. We've been doing that all along. That's how we express learning, is through indirect measures. Either way, we're either looking at direct examples of indirect processes, or we're examining behavior itself. That's the limit. Psychologists can believe in the existence of the soul. They can believe in the existence of dreams having meaning. They can believe in the existence of the id, the ego, and the superego, which we'll get a little bit when we talk about personality. Those are fine, but they lay on the edge or on the outside of the field of psychology, because psychology is a discipline, and that field, for the most part, there's people that go outside. Trust me, I go outside. I do dream interpretations, but go outside of those things because it's fun, it's entertaining, and sometimes extremely useful and valuable. But the field itself really tries to focus on what is directly observable and limits its conclusion to that. And that takes a lot of personal discipline to just focus on those things. So, what happens when psychologists engage in all that? What they're trying to do, they're trying to achieve the goals of the field of psychology. So let's take a look at what those look like. The goals of psychology are pretty straightforward. To describe, explain, predict, and control human and animal behavior. You can actually stick that right into the definition. The description of stuff is the terminology that we use. This is shared terms and meaning, so scientists can be talking about the same thing. So when we are in a position where I have a decision to make. And either way, it's bad. I'm either going to do this, and I don't like that outcome, or I'm going to do this, and I don't like that outcome. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't, stuck in between a hard place and, a rock and a hard place. We have all kinds of terms for that. But the field of psychology has decided they're going to name that cognitive dissonance. There's a name for that experience. So when we are publishing, when we are talking to other experts in the field, we're using the official term and everybody goes, One person might say, oh, damned if you do, damned if you don't. Another person might say, stuck between a rock and a hard place. Doesn't matter. We have that shared terminology, and the field does a lot to label things and describe behavior exactly as we see it. Then we think about explanations. We see things happening together. We'll talk about that in classical conditioning. We see the effect of behavior on other things. We see the effect of stimuli on people's behavior. We see behaviors that happen together. And we try to understand the relationships between the factors and variables involved in behavior. Now, these are usually complex. When we look at basic learning and basic, cognition, some of that is pretty easy, but that's when we're trying to understand the basic concepts. Explaining behavior of a single individual, why somebody would, engage in a school shooting or something like that is very, very difficult. There's lots of factors, many of which are unique to that individual. And we have to be careful not to generalize too much about that because there are so many factors. But we try. Now, once we have an explanation, then we can predict. If I know that a particular way of teaching is going to produce the results that I want, then that's a great skill to have. It's a great piece of knowledge to have that I can then use on the last one, to control behavior, either to bring about what I want or to keep something from happening. So, for example, let's say we came to the conclusion that individuals who were in high school and isolated had a higher tendency to engage in school shooting. And I'm seriously not making light of that and calling that the only reason or whatever. There's people who are isolating in school. Their risk for engaging in shooting is not the only issue. They shouldn't be isolating in school. Maybe they need some help. Maybe they don't have many friends. There's lots of reasons to intervene in that. But let's say we understood that that was one of the factors, isolating. Then if that has some level of prediction, then we can create programs that bring those individuals into the social aspect of the school. We can intervene. We can come up with a plan. And it's the it's the description of what we're looking at. It's an understanding of the variables and how they relate to each other, developing an ability to predict things when they're coming out, and ultimately coming out with a plan to address it. Now, those capsules of knowledge, let's say, that describe, explain, predict, and control, we call those theories. Theories are ideas that are generated that describe, explain, predict, and control, and can be used to control. Not all are complete. Some contradict each other. There's lots of different psychologists come from different angles, and they would They would look at these variables, other people look at these variables, you end up with two theories, and sometimes people who are introduced to the field of psychology, they're like, wow, I wish it was like science. You pour the blue stuff with the red stuff, and it gets smoky, every time. In psychology, even though we have tons and tons of theories for all the different aspects of our human existence, the answer to what do you think will happen if the X, Y, and Z occurs usually starts with the psychologist saying, well, it kind of depends. And they start going through all the other factors that may contribute to predicting. They might use different theories. Different psychologists will use different theories to explain different things. Sometimes they'll use two different theories to explain the same thing, because sometimes it helps for someone to understand something from a different model. For example, I mentioned earlier about the id, ego, and the superego, which is the structural aspect of Sigmund Freud's theory of the personality. Like the id, the ego, and the superego in modern science has largely been disbanded. However, it is still a very useful analogy for, let's say we're looking at the damned if you don't. You're in cognitive dissonance. And often in the movies, what you'll see, and I'll probably bring this up again when we talk about personality, in the movies and the cartoons, you see a little angel and a little devil, and the angel saying, don't take that, and the devil is saying, you deserve that, take it. And here's the person trying to make a decision. That's really how it feels. And that analogy comes from the id, which is the devil, the superego, which is the angel, and the ego, which is me, and the battle of energies that Freud described, which make for a great analogy, not only in how it feels, but then we might take that and say, let's make a list of pros and cons for making a decision to help us doing that. And we're still using a theory that has largely been disbanded by the field of psychology. So even the old stuff comes back sometimes, and it's very useful. So here we have theories that describe, explain, predict, and control. One of my favorite, of course, is intelligence. Now, intelligence is one of those areas that's incredibly complex. There are many theories. In fact, when you get into the field of what is called psychometrics, which is all those ways that we indirectly measure human behavior and human capacity, some say there are as many theories of intelligence as there are tests that measure intelligence. Each test makes an assumption about what intelligence means. Intelligence has been on the forefront of the field of psychology ever since its beginning, and we still don't really have a unified understanding of it. We have multiple understandings of it, all of which help us to understand this sort of mysterious thing we call intelligence. In fact, we're right on the brink now of trying to get our head wrapped around that, accepting the notion that there's diversity in intelligence. It's a scary thing for our society to contemplate, that some people may just not be as smart as other people, depending on the measure. People will be smart at something, and some theories of intelligence focus on that. What are your gifts? And then others will focus on a more generic sense of intelligence, such as the kind of intelligence that makes you successful in school, and that there's diversity there. That's one of the areas in which we are different. And it, just like race and ethnicity and gender and sexual orientation, we appreciate the differences. Intelligence is one of those ones we're having a little bit of trouble admitting that there is diversity in that. So here's a set of theories. One, the classic intelligence quotient, the IQ, probably the most famous measure of intelligence. And then we have Gardner's multiple intelligence theory, which is that this is sort of the skill-based one: body smarts, the kinesthetic intelligence, music intelligence, interpersonal intelligence, literary intelligence, being able to do logic. You see these different kinds of intelligence, and you can see, maybe you'll pick out there, like, I'm a really good dancer and I play music, but I'm really not taking good pictures. And you'll see those different kinds of intelligences here. The IQ, classically used as, people talk about their IQ. The average is 100. How, we'll get into that when we talk about intelligence, but as a rating of how intelligent somebody is. But truthfully, IQ correlates very highly with school stuff. So learning things logically, verbal skills, mathematical skills, writing skills, speaking skills, those are all highly correlated with IQ scores. So while IQ may not predict how well you will go out on a date. It will, however, in a degree, predict how well you're going to do in the school. If you're in high school and you're getting ready to take any standardized test like the Scholastic Aptitude Test, the SAT, or you're in college and you're looking at graduate school for the graduate record exam, each one of those are actually categorized as intelligence tests because they're correlated with how well you will do in college. So if you score high on those, tendency you will do pretty well in the school stuff. It doesn't predict happiness. It doesn't predict how well you do in relationships. It doesn't predict how good you are going to be at soccer. It doesn't do any of that. It just predicts how well you're going to do in school. So we have these different theories. I might, if I'm looking for good people for my soccer team, I might rank their kinesthetic intelligence. I might put them through drills to see which one's going to be the best soccer player. If I'm a college admission person, I might look at the SATs to see who's going to be a good candidate and be successful at my school. So I'm using different measures of intelligence to make different kinds of decisions. And that's, again, what psychology has given us. So we arrive here about the history. Where did these ideas come from? And I'm going to leave a little bit of this to your review of what I put in the course book. And, but I do want to go to a website. And let's see if this works well on here. Click on that. Bring me to a website. This is the, make the text really big. This is the Annenberg Learning podcast page. Annenberg Learning developed a very classic video series, Discovering Psychology. This is the updated edition. And in there is a history timeline. It's a really, really great resource. You scroll here, and the timeline is vertical. Here we have Wilhelm Wundt's first psychology laboratory back in 1876. That doesn't mean that psychology dates back to the Latin world. This is actually history of modern psychology. Probably should address that. So a lot of these ideas about the mind and different functions of the brain and whatnot were already in place by the time this history line starts. The first American psychology laboratory, G. Stanley Hall, he becomes the first president of the American Psychological Association. First doctorate in psychology, 1886. First professor of psychology, James M. Cattell, in 1888. The APA is founded, G. Stanley Hall. Functionalism, psychoanalysis, and structuralism. These are three areas of the field that were sort of combating each other for favor. Now, functionalism looked at this human behavior. What does it do? What is the function of the actual behavior? What does it bring us? Almost that evolutionary stand. Why do we dance? Well, the functionalist said, when we dance, we sweat, pheromones go out, it attracts people to us, makes us, when we're vigorously dancing, it makes that we're, good physical specimens, we're good for mating. Let's get together at the dance and, off and go make children. And that evolutionary point of view as to the function of behavior was the focal point of the functionalist. Now, the structuralist, they were very focused on measurements of the nervous system, like reaction time, if you put a puff of air in your eye, how fast do you blink? How do you adjust to different colors? It was very mechanical in understanding the machinery, not the context, but the machinery in there. And all of this really took the human being out of the equation. It was like either you're evolutionarily functioning and just reacting to survival of the species, or you're a machine. And along comes Freud and says, wait a minute, we're beings that exist with this thing that we call the mind, and he introduces the id, the ego, and the superego, and all of these things are happening at the same time in that history. So, oh, sorry. I saw something on my screen. I thought I had stopped the video. Okay, so here we have the first psychological clinic. Freud introduces interpretation of dreams in 1900. The Manual of Experimental Psychology. This was a lot of this had to do with that structural understanding of human beings. First woman president, pretty early in our history here, Mary Calkins. The IQ test is developed by Alfred Binet. We're going to be talking about him when we talk about IQ. Clifford Beers published A Mind That Found Itself based on his experience as a patient. Okay, that was, again, understanding, this is the beginning of some humane treatment for persons with mental illness. Psychoanalysts visit Clark University. This is a famous meeting of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung came to visit the United States. It's a real famous picture of all of them hanging around with each other. And theoretically, on the boat over, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung got into a disagreement that ended their friendship from that point on. Then behaviorism comes along. Now, behaviorism was a little bit more like functionalist, and they were looking at, well, maybe what we're doing is our thought processes are reacting to the environment around us, and we're adapting and learning. So the learning processes start to come in, and do not underestimate the impact that learning theories have had on our society. Right at this time, if you look at the date, 1913, we're looking at the Industrial Revolution. So with the Industrial Revolution, along comes schooling or mandated schooling, and what is it going to mean for children to be, how will they be educated? And it really shaped the way in which schools began. In 1917, the Army Intelligence Test is one of the first applications of written tests. First African-American doctorate in psychology, Francis Sumner. Jean Piaget studies the children's conception of the world, a very pinnacle. We're gonna talk about him quite a lot. And he was actually, let's go back here to the IQ test. Piaget worked with Alfred Binet as a statistician when he was developing the IQ test, and that led him to the development of his own theory in how children perceive the world. The Rorschach test, I'm going to show you some of that. We talked about personality testing. The Menninger Clinic founded, looking at mental illness and the treatment of that. First Nobel Prize for psychological research. The electroencephalogram, we're finally be able to understanding that electricity goes through the mind and that's an important part of how the brain works. Nazi persecution of psychologists. This is an interesting one because I just read another article about Nazi-based race psychology was a field that used cherry-picked data to justify the atrocities of the Nazis. So some psychologists played a role in furthering the ideas that we could actually measure intelligence by measuring the dimensions of somebody's face. And this was used to categorize Jews as not intelligent and therefore not worthy of existing on the earth, and to see how some science can go in a radically wrong direction with that particular example. Alcoholics Anonymous in 1935. The Gestalt psychologist came along and said all this breaking down of the human being into little parts that existed across all these functionalism, structuralism, behaviorism, Freud, all of that, says there's the classic line in Gestalt psychology is the sum of the parts is, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That's it. I knew I would get it. So there's more to this. There's more to this. And this ushered in these, interestingly enough, the Gestalt, again, coming from Germany, which had all of this Nazi psychology going on. Out of the ashes of that grew this very, very compassionate field of Gestalt psychology and the rise of what we now know as humanism in psychology, with the human being, where we start looking at willpower and decision-making and cognitive processes, really the birth of what I consider modern psychology, how we look at things now. The first lobotomy in the United States, it did occur before there. This was the surgical brain damage that was created in order as a treatment. This was all the rage back then. Karen Horney publishes The Neurotic Personality of Our Time. She challenges a lot of Freud's theories. She was a psychoanalyst, but she came out against Freud. And Skinner, following in the behavioral standpoint, comes up with behaviorism. And behaviorism is introduces the use of the law of effect, rewards and punishments, to shape people's behavior. Felt this was a key aspect of human development. And of all the theories that are out there, it is the one that most completely meets the 4 goals of psychology. So today we still have behavior management, we still have applied behavior analysis, we can still understand and describe things from a behavioral point of view. In this class, we talk about that in the learning chapter, and one of the major assignments is to create a behavior plan for yourself to introduce a new behavior. So you'll be spending some time in that theory. ECT begins, electroconvulsive therapy, 1939. Let's pick this up here. Anna Freud, daughter of Freud, talks about psychoanalysis with children. National Mental Health Act is passed. The first drugs start to come in for the treatment of mental illness. Thorazine, introduced in 1952, introducing the first phase of deinstitutionalization, taking people out of the institutions and back into the community. APA ethical standards get published after a whole lot of bad studies get published. The epilepsy and the functional anatomy, here we see published results on that. We're looking at kind of the notion of the body and nature, again, playing a role in how we interact with the society. Biopsychology, psychopharmacology, we see these areas that are really looking at the biology, kind of a return to the body as a deterministic process here. And here's humanistic psychology, growing out of Gestalt, coming here. We'll be getting into that. Cognitive psychology. Great work by Noam Chomsky about the development of language and what he called the language acquisition device that we'll be talking about in human development. Librium, another drug, comes along that replaces the very detrimental Thorazine that was there, but actually allows people to get out of the institutions. 1963, the Community Mental Health Centers Act passed. John F. Kennedy passing that and transforming our mental health system. Medal of Science to psychologist went to Neil Miller. Talked about motivation and learning. See, a very different focal point at that point. Then we have lithium. 73, homosexuality is removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Lots of advocacy there. PET scans. Evolutionary psychology starts to grab a hold, even though we've been talking about, and certainly way back in the day, Darwin evolution impacted the field of psychology way before it defined itself as a field. The selfish gene, again here, the book that came out with that. Standardized IQ tests are found to be discriminatory. So here's the problem. We had to redo the standardized tests. HIV and AIDS appears in 1981. The Insanity Defense Reform Act was passed. That's in response to the acquittal of John Hinckley Jr. We had to find a way to better understand violence and mental illness. The Homeless Assistance Act, Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, these are still with us. Those drug cultural psychology, the real importance of understanding culture in relation to psychology becomes famous in the year 1990 and the sequencing of the human genome in 2000. So that brings us to this kind of place of understanding that these ideas that we are going to be studying in this class have histories. Each one of the chapters has its history. I won't go over this with each one of the chapters, but we look at the methods have a history, our understanding of personality have a history, understanding of learning, understanding of cognition, our understanding about how the brain develops over time. All of that is covered in each one of these histories. So very important stuff to have. Okay, let's go back to the slideshow. Here we were at the history of psychology. Now here's the logos for the American Psychological Association and the Association of Psychological Science. Both, I'm a member of both of these. The APS is new to me, so I'm still exploring that. Kind of very, as a collection of psychologists who wanted to move away from the overarching power that the APA has and create their own organization and standards, and lots of fun there. The APA, however, is the largest organization, professional organization in the world. The APA, even though it says American Psychological Association, has international parts to it. So the Canadian Psychological Association, the Brazilian Psychological Association, the Russian Psychological Association is a way to unify the efforts of all psychologists. So let's take a look at that. Here's where you're going to address part of what I'm expecting in this class. If you go to apa.org, there is so much information here. I want to point out two things. One is when we look at the APA, here's about the APA. We click on that, and then we go over to divisions of the APA. There are 54 divisions. Look at all of these. These are Society for Consulting, Educational Psych, Military Psych, Engineering Psych, Consumer Psych, Behavior Analysis, all these different subfields. These are whole divisions within the field of psychology. You can explore each one of them having their own website, each one of them having one or more journals. But maybe a quicker way to explore this, you could explore through the divisions, but you look at topics. And there's featured topics, suicide and suicide prevention, climate change, racism, psychology in the workplace. Yeah, we're talking about all of this stuff. Here's all the psychological topics here. They must be working on aging because that's not a link anymore. But let's look at bullying. So if you look up bullying, and these are all kinds of free resources that are going to go here. There's the APA. Here's the definition. And then here's how parents and teachers and kids can take action. Beware of cyberbullying. Stop office bullying. News from the APA. This is research related to bullying. Here's a podcast by the APA speaking of bullying. Resources here on bullying. I mean, there's lots and lots of stuff. Different education, the U.S. laws, and even links to books where you can teach children about bullying. How cool is that? I'm back on Brightspace there. So these are the resources that are available on the APA website. Wow, go explore, go look at that stuff. It's really fun. And that leaves us with what are my expectations for this class in terms of your assignments. So let's take a look at these. The assessments for this week include a Chapter 1 discussion where I'm asking you to go onto the APA website and reflect on at least 2 areas in the field of psychology that were surprising or new to you. I then have a quiz where you're going to consider the 4 goals of psychology and provide an example from a specific psychological problem and how the field achieves these goals. So again, you'd be on the APA website. Look, let's say you did bullying. How does it define it? How does it explain it? How does it predict it? And how does it attempt to control it? You can get that information from there and summarize that in the quiz. And finally, this interesting assignment is I'm asking you to go to a website on the history of psychology, and that one contains names of tons and tons and tons of psychologists in history. You can actually even, it's a wiki site, not the best and most valid place to go for this kind of information, but it's a Wikipedia, and it's a, and look up the biographies of different psychologists. So I want you to pick one, and the make-believe situation that we're in is I'm hiring someone to teach for me here at KVCC, and you are going to write a resume acting like that person. You're going to write a cover letter and a resume outlining your history and your personal history and whatnot, as if you were applying for that job. So rather than just doing a plain old biography, I'm asking you to do it in the form of a cover letter and a resume. So if you've never written a cover letter addresses the job and highlights things in your work history and in your personal life that make you a good fit for that job. And then you attach a document called a resume, and it's formatted. You can look up Microsoft Word resume format and boom, just fill in the blanks. But you're putting in there your address, you're putting in there contact information, your work history, your research history, personal history, and any other lists of publications or something like that, the things that would go into a resume. You get that from the wiki site on that particular person, or do some other research, and then construct that document, and the first page of the single document is the cover page, then the resume attached to that, all one file. And so a fun assignment in not only understanding the history of a psychologist, but also the history, not the history, but the ability to write a resume and a cover letter, which is cool. Now, I would suggest that you pick someone obscure, because if you pick Freud, you're going to have a very, very long assignment, because he did a lot. Whereas you might pick someone that just kind of quirks your interest a little bit. They did something special, and maybe that was the only thing that they're really famous for, but dig a little and find out what, where they get their schooling, what do they have for degrees and all that stuff, and have some fun with this particular assignment. Okay, and that's it for this episode here, Chapter 1. I hope this has been an entertaining and fun process. My effort will be to get these out on a very timely basis to support the work that is in the course book. So take good care of yourself, and I will see you next time.